Welcome to the Wellbeing Podcast, where every episode is a step towards a healthier, happier you. Let's grow, thrive, and shine together. Don't forget to subscribe and like the Wellbeing Podcast. Share your thoughts, and let us know in the comments what topics you'd love to hear about in future episodes. All right, get ready for a deep dive into anxiety today. We've got medical guides, personal stories, even some historical perspectives on this feeling that we all know a little too well. Are
Absolutely.
you ready to unpack all this?
Anxiety is something that touches every single one of us in some way.
Okay, so before we get in the nitty-gritty, let's start with the basics.
Yeah,
What exactly is anxiety, and how is it different from just everyday stress?
that's a great place to start. You see, one of the sources describes anxiety as our body's natural alarm system. It's that fight or flight response kicking in, even when there's no real danger present.
So it's like my brain thinks there's a tiger in the bushes, when it's just the wind rustling the leaves.
Precisely. And while that response can be helpful in truly dangerous situations, it can become a problem when it's constantly triggered by everyday events.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've got this alarm system going off. But how does anxiety actually show up for us? It's not just a feeling, right?
Right. Anxiety manifests in both our minds and our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
One source lists a whole bunch of physical symptoms: racing heart, sweaty palms, dizziness. Have you ever experienced any of those?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially the racing heart. It's like my heart is about to beat out of my chest. And then there's the mental side, those what-if thoughts that just spiral out of control. What if I mess up? What if everyone's judging me? Does that happen to you?
It's incredibly common. Those spiraling thoughts are a hallmark of anxiety,
Mm.
and they can really amplify the physical symptoms.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The physical symptoms feed the anxious thoughts, and the anxious thoughts make the physical symptoms worse.
Exactly. And to make things even more complex, anxiety isn't a one-size-fits-all experience. Turns out there are different types of anxiety disorders.
Yeah, I was reading about that in one of the sources. Generalized anxiety, social anxiety, panic disorder is not just one big umbrella term.
That's an important point. Each type has its own unique set of symptoms and triggers. For instance, one source mentions something called a specific phobia, an intense fear of a particular object or situation. Spiders, heights, enclosed spaces. The list goes on and on.
Okay, so we've got this complex web of anxiety types and symptoms. It can feel pretty overwhelming, to be honest, so what can we actually do about it?
The good news is there are a variety of ways to manage anxiety. One of the guides we have focuses on practical coping strategies that you can use in the moment. Things like breathing exercises, muscle relaxation techniques, even using a wristband as a physical reminder to snap out of negative thought patterns.
A wristband. That's interesting. I've never heard of that before.
It's a technique designed to interrupt those spiraling thoughts. You wear a wristband, and whenever you notice yourself getting anxious, you snap it against your wrist. That physical sensation can help bring you back to the present moment and break the cycle of worry.
Wow, that's actually pretty clever. It's like a little wake-up call for your brain. So what about therapy? Is that something that can help with anxiety?
Absolutely. Therapy can be incredibly beneficial, especially a type called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. One source really dives into the effectiveness of CBT for anxiety. It's all about identifying and challenging those negative thought patterns that fuel anxiety and replacing them with more balanced and realistic ones.
So it's not just about talking about your feelings. It's about actively changing the way you think.
Exactly. CBT teaches you practical skills and techniques to manage anxiety in different situations. You learn to recognize the thought patterns that are causing you distress and develop strategies to reframe them in a more positive light. It's all about empowering you to take control of your thoughts rather than letting them control you.
That's fascinating. Sounds like CBT gives you a whole new toolkit for dealing with anxiety. And speaking of tools, there's another technique mentioned in one of the sources that I found really interesting: graded exposure.
Ah, yes, graded exposure. It's particularly effective for phobias and other specific anxieties. It involves gradually exposing yourself to the thing you fear, starting with small steps and working your way up. Think of it like climbing a wordy ladder.
So for someone with a fear of elevators, the first step might be just standing in front of the elevator doors, and then eventually working up to actually riding in one.
Exactly. The idea is to gradually desensitize yourself to the fear by proving to your brain that it's not actually as dangerous as you perceive it to be. It takes time and effort, but it can be incredibly liberating.
I can see how that would be a really powerful way to overcome specific fears. But I think it's important to remember that everyone's different. What works for one person might not work for another.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to managing anxiety. It's all about exploring different strategies and finding what resonates with you and helps you feel more in control of your experience.
The key is finding what works for you. And something else that really stood out to me in these sources is this idea that anxiety isn't always a bad thing.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, one source explains that anxiety can actually be helpful in certain situations. It can sharpen our senses, make us more alert, and motivate us to take action. Think about it. If you're walking down a dark street at night, a little bit of anxiety might make you more aware of your surroundings and help you stay safe.
That's a really interesting perspective. So it's not about eliminating anxiety altogether. It's about managing it so that it works for us, not against us.
Precisely. It's about finding that sweet spot between healthy anxiety that keeps us safe and motivated and excessive anxiety that interferes with our lives.
You know, one thing that really struck me while reading through these sources was the connection between anxiety and our thoughts, the way our thoughts can actually create and perpetuate anxiety, even when there's no real threat present.
Yes, it's like our minds can be our own worst enemies sometimes.
Absolutely. And that's why learning to challenge those negative thought patterns is so crucial for managing anxiety. It's a reminder that we have more control over our anxiety than we might realize.
You know, going through all of this information with you, one of the most surprising things to me was learning about panic disorder. I've always wondered, what does a panic attack actually feel like?
Panic attacks can be incredibly intense and frightening. One of the sources describes them as sudden and overwhelming episodes of fear that can manifest in a variety of physical symptoms: a racing heart, sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, chest pain, dizziness. It can feel like you're having a heart attack or even dying.
Wow, that sounds terrifying. No wonder people who experience panic attacks can develop such a fear of them happening again.
Exactly. It's like your body's fight or flight response is going into overdrive, even though there's no real danger. But thankfully, there are effective treatments available. CBT can be incredibly helpful in managing panic disorder, as it helps individuals identify and manage the triggers and thought patterns that contribute to panic attacks.
So it's about understanding the root cause of the anxiety
Yeah.
and developing coping mechanism to deal with it.
Exactly. And in addition to therapy, medication can also be helpful in managing the symptoms of panic disorder. It's important to remember that there's no shame in seeking professional help. If you're struggling with panic attacks or any other type of anxiety disorder, there are qualified professionals who can provide support and guidance.
That's a great reminder. And speaking of support, one of the sources really emphasizes the importance of social connections in managing anxiety.
That's a crucial point. Connecting with others can provide a sense of belonging and reduce feelings of isolation, which can often exacerbate anxiety.
So it's not just about seeking professional help, it's also about building a strong support system of friends and family who you can talk to and rely on.
Exactly. Sharing your experiences and feelings with trusted individuals can make a world of difference. And it's also about finding healthy ways to cope with stress in general. One source mentions the benefits of exercise, relaxation techniques, and limiting caffeine and alcohol intake.
Those are all great strategies. Exercise releases endorphins, which have mood-boosting effects. Relaxation techniques such as deep breathing and meditation can help calm the nervous system. And reducing caffeine and alcohol can improve sleep quality and reduce overall anxiety levels.
Precisely. It's about taking a holistic approach to well-being and making lifestyle choices that support mental health. Creating a foundation of healthy habits can help us navigate the challenges of life and manage anxiety more effectively.
You know, one thing that really resonated with me in these sources is this idea that anxiety can actually be a sign of strength.
That's an interesting perspective. How so?
Well, one source explains that anxiety is often associated with high levels of empathy and sensitivity.
I see your point. People who are highly anxious may be more attuned to the emotions of others and more likely to pick up on subtle cues.
Exactly. And this can be a valuable trait in many situations, for example, in creative fields or in careers that involve caring for others.
That's a great observation. It's about reframing our understanding of anxiety and recognizing that it can be a source of strength as well as a challenge.
And it's about accepting ourselves as we are, including our anxieties, and working with them rather than against them.
I completely agree. Self-acceptance is a key ingredient in managing anxiety and living a fulfilling life. Speaking of self-acceptance, one source highlights the importance of challenging negative self-talk.
Ah, yes, the inner critic. That voice in our heads that can be so harsh and judgmental.
Exactly, and it can really fuel our anxiety, so it's important to become aware of those negative thoughts and challenge them with more realistic and compassionate ones.
One technique that I've found helpful is to ask myself, would I say this to a friend?
Mm,
If the answer is no, then it's probably not a helpful or kind thought to be directing towards myself either.
that's a great tip. And it reminds us to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a loved one. Self-compassion is essential for managing anxiety and promoting well-being.
So we've talked about the different types of anxiety, the importance of social connections, healthy coping mechanisms, and challenging negative self-talk. But there's one thing I'm still curious about. This source mentions that anxiety can be a learned response. But how exactly do we learn to be anxious?
That's a great question. There are several ways we can learn to be anxious. One is through observation. For example, if we grew up with anxious parents or caregivers, we may learn to interpret certain situations as dangerous or threatening, even if they're not.
So it's like we inherit their anxiety.
Not necessarily inherit, but we definitely pick up on their behaviors and thought patterns. Another way we can learn to be anxious is through negative experiences. For example, if we have a traumatic experience or a series of stressful events, we may develop a heightened sense of vigilance and fear.
So it's like our brains are trying to protect us from future harm.
Exactly, but sometimes that protection mechanism can go into overdrive and lead to excessive anxiety. And finally, this source mentions that we can also learn to be anxious through reinforcement. For example, if we avoid a situation that makes us anxious, we may feel a sense of relief in the short term.
But in the long term, that avoidance only strengthens the anxiety, right?
Precisely. Because it prevents us from learning that the situation is not actually as dangerous as we perceive it to be. So it's important to challenge those avoidance behaviors and gradually expose ourselves to the things that make us anxious in a safe and controlled way.
That makes a lot of sense. So we can learn to be anxious. But the good news is we can also learn to manage it and even overcome it.
Absolutely. Our brains are incredibly adaptable. And with the right tools and support, we can rewire our thinking and develop healthier coping mechanisms.
That's such an empowering message. And it gives me hope that anxiety doesn't have to control our lives.
It really doesn't. There is hope and there is help available.
That's a great reminder for all of us.
It is, and it's something we should all keep in mind as we navigate the ups and downs of life.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but I'm curious, what's one thing that really stood out to you as particularly insightful or helpful?
What really resonated with me was the emphasis on self-compassion. It's so easy to be hard on ourselves when we're struggling with anxiety, but it's important to remember that we're all human and we all make mistakes.
Yes. And that we deserve to be treated with kindness and understanding,
Yeah.
even when we're not at our best.
Exactly. Self-compassion is a powerful antidote to anxiety, and it can help us navigate difficult emotions with more grace and resilience.
I love that. And I think it's a message we all need to hear. It's a reminder that we're not alone in our struggles and that there's always hope for healing and growth.
Well said. And that's a beautiful note to transition to part 2 of this deep dive.
See you there.
It's fascinating how this whole idea of self-compassion ties into the concept of control, which is something that comes up a lot in these
Oh,
sources.
it's interesting. How so?
Well, one source points out that a lot of anxiety stems from feeling like things are spiraling out of control, whether it's our thoughts, our emotions, or even like external circumstances.
That makes perfect sense. When I feel like I'm losing control, my anxiety definitely spikes.
Exactly. But what's really empowering is this idea that even in situations where we can't control the outcome, we can still control our response.
You know, that reminds me of that quote, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
That's a perfect illustration. It's about recognizing our limitations while also embracing our agency.
So how can we actually cultivate that sense of control when anxiety starts to creep in?
One source highlights the importance of developing coping mechanisms that help us stay grounded and centered, even when things feel chaotic. Think of it like having a toolbox full of strategies that you can pull out whenever you need them.
I like that analogy. So what kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, there are a lot of different techniques out there, but one that's mentioned repeatedly in these sources is mindfulness.
I've heard of mindfulness, but I'll admit I'm not entirely sure what it means in practice.
It's essentially about paying attention to the present moment without judgment, noticing your thoughts, feelings, and sensations as they arise, without getting swept away by them.
So it's not about emptying your mind or trying to stop thinking altogether.
Not at all. It's more about becoming an observer of your thoughts, rather than getting caught up in the stories they're telling.
That sounds like a real challenge, especially when those thoughts are racing and spiraling.
It definitely takes practice. But with time, mindfulness can become a powerful tool for managing stress. and cultivating a sense of inner peace. A simple way to start practicing mindfulness is to focus on your breath. Notice the sensation of each inhale and exhale, and gently redirect your attention back to your breath whenever your mind starts to wander.
So it's about anchoring yourself to the present moment, rather than getting lost in worries about the past or future.
Exactly. And the beautiful thing about mindfulness is that it can be practiced anywhere, anytime. You can bring mindfulness to everyday activities like washing the dishes or taking a walk by simply paying attention to the sensations and experiences of the present moment.
I love that idea. It's about finding those pockets of stillness and awareness throughout our day.
Absolutely. And those moments can be incredibly restorative and grounding, especially when we're feeling anxious or overwhelmed.
One question that often comes up when we talk about anxiety is why some people seem to struggle with it more than others.
That's something I've always wondered about too. Is it just a matter of personality? Or are there other factors at play?
That's something I've always wondered about too.
It's a complex question, and there's no single answer. But one source suggests that genetics may play a role. Some people might be predisposed to anxiety due to their genes.
So it's possible that some of us are just wired to be more anxious than others?
It's possible, but it's important to remember that genes are not destiny. Our environment and our experiences also play a significant role in shaping our mental health.
So even if someone has a genetic predisposition to anxiety, they can still learn to manage it effectively with the right tools and support.
Absolutely. That's where therapy, lifestyle changes, and a strong support system come in. It's a reminder that we have more agency than we often realize, and that even in the face of challenges, there's always hope for healing and growth.
I find that so empowering. It means that anxiety doesn't have to define us or limit our potential.
It really doesn't, and it's important to remember that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. There are so many resources available, from therapists and support groups to online communities and self-help books. You don't have to go through this alone.
That's such an important message to share, especially since anxiety can feel so isolating.
It can be incredibly isolating. But the truth is that you're not alone in this experience. Millions of people struggle with anxiety, and there are people out there who understand what you're going through and want to help.
As we're wrapping up part 2 of this deep dive, one thing that's really resonated with me is this idea that anxiety can be a learned response. But what if it's not just a learned response, but also a learned behavior?
That's a fascinating thought. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we can learn to be anxious through observation, negative experiences, and reinforcement, as we discussed earlier, then maybe we can also unlearn those patterns and behaviors.
I love that perspective. It opens up a whole new avenue for exploration and possibility.
Exactly. If we can understand the mechanisms by which anxiety is learned, perhaps we can develop more targeted and effective treatments to unlearn it. It's a reminder that there's always more to discover, and that hope for healing is always possible.
That's such an inspiring thought to carry with us as we move into part 3 of this deep dive. It really is remarkable how much our brains are capable of changing and adapting.
It's funny because when I think about anxiety, I often picture it as this giant immovable obstacle. But the more we explore this topic, the more I'm realizing that it's actually quite fluid and malleable.
That's a great way to put it. And that realization can be incredibly empowering because it means we're not stuck with anxiety as some fixed part of ourselves. We have the ability to shape our relationship with it.
So if anxiety is something we can learn and unlearn, what does that mean for how we approach treatment and recovery?
Well, one of the sources highlights the importance of addressing the underlying causes of anxiety, rather than just treating the symptoms. It's like treating a wound. You need to clean and disinfect it, not just cover it up with a bandage.
That makes a lot of sense. So what are some ways we can go about cleaning and disinfecting the wounds of anxiety, so to speak?
One approach that's mentioned repeatedly in these sources is therapy, and not just any kind of therapy, but specifically those that focus on understanding and changing our thought patterns and behaviors.
Like the cognitive behavioral therapy we talked about earlier.
Exactly. CBT is a powerful tool for identifying and challenging the negative thought patterns that fuel anxiety. It teaches you to recognize those thoughts, question their validity, and replace them with more balanced and realistic ones.
And the idea is that by changing the way we think, we can also change the way we feel and behave.
Precisely. It's about breaking those negative feedback loops that keep us trapped in anxiety. But therapy isn't the only tool in the toolbox. These sources also highlight the importance of lifestyle changes.
What kind of lifestyle changes are we talking about?
Things like regular exercise, a healthy diet, getting enough sleep, and managing stress. These might sound like simple things, but they can have a profound impact on our mental health.
It's like building a strong foundation for our overall well-being. When we take care of ourselves physically, we're also taking care of ourselves mentally.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to managing anxiety. What works for one person might not work for another.
So it's about experimenting with different techniques and finding what resonates with you and helps you feel more in control.
Exactly. And it's about being patient with yourself. Recovery from anxiety is a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs along the way, but it's important to keep moving forward, one step at a time.
As we've been delving into this topic, I've noticed that a lot of these coping strategies for anxiety seem to overlap with strategies for general well-being.
That's a great observation, and it makes sense when you think about it. Anxiety is often a symptom of deeper issues, whether it's stress, trauma, or unhealthy coping mechanisms.
So by addressing those underlying issues and cultivating a healthier lifestyle, we can not only manage anxiety, but also improve our overall quality of life.
Absolutely. It's about creating a life that is aligned with our values and that supports our mental, physical, and emotional well-being.
That's such an inspiring goal, and it's a reminder that even in the face of anxiety, we have the power to create a life that is full of joy, meaning, and purpose.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the world of anxiety, and I hope you, our listener, are walking away from this with a better understanding of this complex emotion, as well as a renewed sense of hope and empowerment.
Me too. It's been a fascinating journey. I feel like I've learned so much. We've explored the different types of anxiety, the ways it manifests in our minds and bodies, and the various tools and techniques we can use to manage it.
We've also challenged the notion that anxiety is always a bad thing, recognizing that it can also be a source of strength and motivation.
And, most importantly, we've emphasized that you're not alone in this journey. There are resources available, and support is just a phone call or click away.
So don't be afraid to reach out for help if you're struggling. There's no shame in seeking support, and it can make a world of difference.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. We've talked about how anxiety can be both a learned response and a learned behavior. But what if we can take that a step further and think of anxiety as a skill?
A skill. That's an intriguing idea.
What if instead of trying to eliminate anxiety altogether, we could learn to harness its energy and channel it in a positive direction?
That's a powerful concept. It's about reframing anxiety as a source of potential, rather than something to be feared or avoided.
Exactly. What if we could learn to use our anxiety to fuel our creativity, our problem-solving abilities, our resilience?
I love that perspective. It's a reminder that even our challenges can be transformed into opportunities for growth and transformation.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that possibility. Thanks for listening to the Wellbeing Podcast. Take care, stay inspired, and see you next time.